Tiana Tozer, welcome to Traipsin Global on Wheels podcast. We are so glad to have you, and so thank you so much for coming on.
You're welcome. It's great to be here.
So for listeners that are not as familiar with Tiana Tozer, after a career in public relations, Tiana moved to Iraq to become a humanitarian aid worker. In Iraq, she implemented an innovative program that taught people with disabilities how to advocate for themselves and become social change agents. In Sudan, she was the state director in Southern Kordofan, running a program to build government capacity to deliver services before she was extracted from the civil war. Since being injured by an intoxicated driver at the age of 20, Tiana has worked to change attitudes about people with disabilities. She lobbied for the ADA, sat on the board of the National Industries for the Severely Handicapped, now SourceAmerica. Most recently, she ran an employment program for people with disabilities, a two-time Paralympic medalist bringing home bronze and silver. Tiana was a member of the USA women's wheelchair basketball team for 5 years. She has been featured on NBC Nightly News, NPR's Here Now, and The Takeaway. Welcome, Tiana.
Thank you.
I know you live in Portland, Oregon, to settle in, and how has it changed over the years in terms of wheelchair accessibility?
So I chose Portland, Oregon because Eugene is sort of where my life changed, where I became disabled when I was run over by an intoxicated driver. And I just loved Oregon, and I loved the Eugene community. I probably would have gone back to Eugene, except for there are more jobs in Portland. And so I just knew that I always wanted to come back to Portland. What I would say about Portland, I would say things everywhere are getting more accessible and really, really accessible. There's still issues with older buildings and stuff like that, but I feel like accessibility in the States is good right now. Especially in Portland, with the buses are all accessible, the MAX is accessible. There's I do feel that doctors give out way too many handicap parking permits to people who don't need them. But other than that, I feel like Portland is a really accessible city.
So you said Oregon, Portland's very accessible. So has it become more wheelchair friendly, or do you feel like it was always a wheelchair friendly city?
So I'm going to answer that in a different way, because I don't feel like the biggest barrier that people face every day are physical barriers. I think it's attitudinal barriers. So I think we've gotten to the point where people are so condescending to people with wheelchairs and so like, oh my gosh, you're disabled, can I help you? That people with disabilities don't view themselves as capable as they really are. And I think that is the major barrier to people with disabilities, is all these people think they can't, so they also think they can't. So rather than trying, we just accept those limitations that are placed on us by other people. So for me, attitudes are a way greater barrier than any set of stairs or any lack of an elevator. I mean, I can figure out to get anywhere I want to go. And I think most people with disabilities who are living their lives can figure that out. But it's when we buy into this myth that, able-bodied people look at somebody in a wheelchair and they're like, oh my God, that's the worst possible thing. I would kill myself if I couldn't walk. And I'm thinking to myself, wow, you're a wimp, So I think we really need to move beyond the limitations that other people place on us, and also to quit placing limitations on ourselves, to try before we give up.
So I understand that, yeah, you're right. Attitude is very important. And I've noticed that despite different cultures, attitudes towards individuals with disabilities, there's a similarity there with how people react to people with disabilities. So I understand you only use a wheelchair part-time, some of the time. So what kind of wheelchair do you use? What brand, model?
So I used a wheelchair for 4 years. I had a brief interlude where I could walk, and then I had a hip surgery. So I used a wheelchair for 2 years. I had a brief interlude where I could walk, and then I had a hip surgery that put me back in the chair for 2 years. And then I used a wheelchair part-time for about 15 years. And in 2007, my doctor said to me, "Why are you using a wheelchair?" And I'm like, "Well, because I'm supposed to preserve my joints." And he said, "That's old school. You need to quit running around in your wheelchair." So I no longer use a wheelchair except for sports. I do still have a wheelchair. I have an old quickie sports chair with no casters on the back, because when I was playing wheelchair basketball, you couldn't have casters on the back. And then I also have a quickie everyday with big front casters. And I keep them around because eventually I'll probably one day be in a wheelchair again, or need it for a short period of time or something like that.
I see. Okay, so that helps me gain an understanding of, different perspectives. There are different disabilities, and with that comes different perspectives. As I heard, earlier, you used your wheelchair more before. When you were using it more frequently, what kind of malfunctions did you encounter, and how did you resolve these issues?
Yeah, I always had a rigid frame, so I very rarely did I have malfunctions with my wheelchair. Occasionally I get a flat tire. I had a service that would come out and change it while I was at work. The most annoying thing about that, though, is these services, like it was Providence Home Care or something, and I called them, and she kept calling me. This was back when we didn't have cell phones. She kept calling me on my home phone number, and finally I was like, "Lady, yes, I have a disability, but I work. You have to call me at my work number." And so assumptions like that are really annoying and also keep you from getting the service that you need. That was the most striking thing about the last time I can remember I had a flat tire. But for the most part, I didn't really have any wheelchair malfunctions. I mean, there's this one time when I was at University of Illinois and everything was icy, and we were all coming back from Christmas for early practice, and the guys were like all in the middle of the parking lot, and they sort of waved at me, and I waved back, and then I hit the edge of the parking lot and started to slide. What had happened is the parking lot was iced over, and our wheels had slid down, and we were all like stuck in the drain. And I was like, I got to the bottom of the drain where I was resting with all the guys. I'm like, "Why didn't you guys tell me that the parking lot was iced over?" And they go, "Because it's funnier just to let you slide in." And so we had to wait there until one of the grad assistants came by and pulled us out. So it's more stuff like that, like, weather, or even like weather walking is difficult for me because I have such bad balance.
I see. So the next few questions are on humanitarian work. So I see that you've done some humanitarian work with Mercy Corps in Sudan and Iraq. So what are the challenges for individuals with disabilities who want to do international humanitarian work, especially wheelchair users, since you have that experience? And how can they overcome these challenges? What have you learned from your experience that you can share with others?
Well, first of all, I think it's super important that people with disabilities get involved in humanitarian work, because people with disabilities around the world are the poorest of the poor, and humanitarian aid does not address their needs. For the most part, people with disabilities, they address their needs through supply projects like crutches and wheelchairs. And don't get me started on the free wheelchair mission. If anybody out there is donating to the free wheelchair mission, you are not helping anybody with a disability. Yeah, so they take lawn chairs and they make them into wheelchairs. And it does nothing to improve anyone's accessibility, because those countries are not accessible. If you really want to donate a wheelchair to someone in a developing country, whirlwind wheelchair. They have it's designed so the front can go off like a 2-foot drop and you can still stay in your chair. But these plastic wheelchairs, I hear in Vietnam they don't want any more of them and they keep trashing them, so they're just piles of them around. I trashed 50 of them in Iraq because they're just not suitable for the environment. And also, we wouldn't sell them here in the United States. So if they're not good enough for us, why are they good enough for people overseas? What I would say to you is we need more people with disabilities in humanitarian aid work, and we also need more people in wheelchairs. One of the biggest issues is for paraplegics who require catheters, and they get them through Medicare or Medicaid. My understanding is you can't use that when you are overseas. I was working with a young woman from University of Illinois who wanted to go overseas, and that was her biggest issue, is she couldn't figure out healthcare. Healthcare is a huge issue. Now, if you have a job overseas, you usually have healthcare, but I'm not sure. It was something about covering the catheters and her supplies that she couldn't do it, which I thought was really disappointing.
Yeah, no, that is.
If you want to go overseas, first of all, it's not going to be that accessible. So I would definitely, if you're going to a developing country, I'd definitely look into a whirlwind wheelchair or a wheelchair. Like, I was on one of those outdoor wheelchairs, and I know they're way expensive, but the ones with the tracks, so awesome. So something like that would be really helpful if you use a wheelchair overseas. But I think you could get around in a whirlwind, and they aren't that expensive. They're only $65. It's not only, you also have to be very flexible, because if you use a wheelchair full time and you're overseas, nothing is accessible. Like hotel rooms in Iraq are not accessible. The bathroom doors aren't accessible. The houses in Iraq, they have these little lips between the rooms. I mean, it's just crazy. I took my wheelchair to Iraq, both my everyday and my basketball chair, and I could get around well enough inside buildings, but outside buildings, it was crazy and really not useful at all. I do think, but there are people who use wheelchairs in Iraq, and they get around. You just have to be very flexible. I would encourage you to do humanitarian work, but be prepared for frustrating accessibility. But I think there are also ways, if you're a wheelchair user, that you can get around the physical barriers. The health insurance barrier, I'm not sure how to get around that, because it seems to me like young people in wheelchairs should be able to do internships and work overseas and still be able to access the Medicaid or Medicare that they need that for their everyday needs, their activities of daily living. So that would be my recommendation. And also for people who travel, if you are insistent that everything be accessible, I would only travel to countries like Australia and New Zealand. But
I feel like it's against the law to discriminate and not provide those services, because that would be considered reasonable accommodation.
In other countries, Iraq doesn't have that. This is when I was in Iraq or Sudan. I was talking to a young woman at University of Illinois, and she really wanted to do an internship, and I really wanted her to do it, but I think it's Medicaid just said, if you go overseas, we won't provide your catheters. So she had to abandon that. And it should be against the law.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Insurance is a human right, in my opinion.
Can you elaborate on why it's so crucial for individuals with disabilities, wheelchair users especially, to be involved in international humanitarian work and the specifics of what they can contribute?
Well, because able-bodied people are humanitarian aid workers, and they don't understand the specific needs of people with disabilities. They don't understand how to do inclusive development. And people with disabilities are the poorest of the poor all over the world, including in the United States. So the UN has these millennial goals, which I think have passed now, but to get rid of poverty. You are never going to get rid of poverty in the world until you address and include people with disabilities, because they are the poorest of the poor. And so they have all these programs that are like giving them wheelchairs and crutches, but what they need is they need access to education, and they need access to microfinance, and they need access to all the other things that humanitarian aid provides to able-bodied people. But they don't get it because there's nobody out there banging the drum saying, hey, what about people with disabilities?
Mm-hmm. I see. So I think in one of the articles that I was reading, it mentioned that there are a lot of international agencies out there that people can volunteer for. So do you recommend for wheelchair users to just book a plane ticket and volunteer at one of these agencies? What are the pros and cons to doing this, especially keeping in mind the physical barriers, the primitive conditions in refugee camps, just to give one example?
I would not recommend just booking a ticket and going over. I would recommend calling the agency, talking to them, and getting some information about what the physical barriers are. Because if you just book a ticket, you may be stuck in one place. And you also need to make arrangements. You need to make sure before you go overseas, you need to make sure that you have enough catheters for the 2 weeks or the month that you're going to be there, that you have enough, whatever your daily activities of living require. When I went overseas, I would take extra wheelchair parts because you cannot get your wheelchair repaired over there. So I would not recommend just booking a ticket. I think it needs to be a planned out, well thought out, well planned trip. But I think your biggest barrier is going to be with the organization, because they're going to be like, how can this person help us? Oh my God, what are they going to do? When I was moving from Iraq to Sudan, they were running around like crazy. Like, how do we make this building wheelchair accessible? Nobody had bothered to ask me whether or not I used a wheelchair full time. And nobody had told them. And so I was like, hey, guys, don't worry. I'm a walking wounded. I can get by. You don't have to do anything to the building. So I think your biggest barrier, once again, getting overseas to volunteer, will be attitudes and people not understanding exactly what you're capable of, and them putting limitations on your abilities without even knowing you or seeing you or meeting you.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's definitely that. And then on another side, there are people that will need the full accommodation in terms of ramps or elevators and whatnot. So given these physical infrastructure limitations and other, medical obstacle courses, do you recommend people with disabilities, we're focusing specifically on wheelchair users, for wheelchair users who are unable to stand up at all and would like to do this kind of work, do you think they would thrive in this kind of work, especially thinking back to your job in Iraq and Sudan?
So it depends. If you're passionate about it, sure, you're going to thrive in it. But I think that having a mobility issue overseas in a developing country is very difficult. That being said, there are a ton of people with disabilities overseas living with disabilities. And so I think that wheelchair users who are willing to take that leap and do the research and follow their passion would be a great bonus to humanitarian aid work and development, because I think that they would set an example for how you can live your life.
So our next set of questions is on attitudes towards people with disabilities. 1 in 3 Americans will experience a disability in their lifetime. 1 in 5 are already disabled, dealing with diabetes, ADHD, Asperger's, dyslexia, mental illness. And the cost to the American taxpayer is $260 billion a year, not including unrealized taxes. If any other minority had a 70% unemployment rate, Americans would be up.
Statistics from the census and actual statistics, and they were relevant in 2016. I'm not sure if it's increased. Or
Yeah, they're from 2016. That's right. So why is the 70% unemployment rate okay and all the other stats I just listed? How can people start changing their attitudes? What are the tangible things that they can do daily to change their attitudes regarding this population?
I would start by not making assumptions. Like when I meet somebody, and even if they're wearing a helmet and they're drooling, I talk directly to the person. I never make an assumption about what they're capable of or what they're not capable of. And as I said in my TED Talk, people with disabilities are perfectly capable of asking for help, and it's okay if you let them. You don't have to run up and help them. We can ask for help. Most of us can, and usually people who can't are out with a companion or something. And so I just think we need to start having expectations of people with disabilities and not expecting them to be super crips, like everybody's a Paralympian or all blind people are going to climb Mount Everest, but just that we allow them to exercise their abilities to the best of their ability, and we don't place attitudinal limitations on that by pitying them or making assumptions about them.
That's very good. So, what is the biggest barrier to having a healthier attitude towards individuals with disabilities? Because, this is not, disability isn't anything new. People with disabilities have been in existence since the beginning of human beings. So what is the barrier that's making people have the attitude shift? Why is it so difficult?
I think because people pity people with disabilities and they're afraid to call them on their bullshit. So if I'm being rude and I'm in a wheelchair, nobody's going to say, quit being rude because I'm a poor crippled child, right? And so I think that people with disabilities oftentimes get away with behavior that we wouldn't accept from able-bodied people. If you have a disability, to believe in yourself and to follow your dreams and not let people place limitations on your ability. And if you don't have a disability, to let people with disabilities define their own abilities and achieve their potential. And I think that people who get angry at that are people who feel entitled. And this world doesn't owe you anything. And what you do with those opportunities are up to you. Now, do I expect somebody with Down syndrome to go and be the CEO of a company? No, but I expect them to contribute to the very best of their ability. And a ton of them do. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I definitely think that, especially for our millennial generation, there is a lot of entitlement going on. I think as individuals with disabilities, we are told that we are brave or strong just for living our lives. How have you pushed yourself out of these patronizing narratives and lived a fulfilling life that is of your own making?
I'm an overachiever, and I think that's because I keep on trying to prove to this world that I deserve to be a first-class citizen. And one of the reasons I don't call myself an inspirational speaker is because I think that you yourself have to decide what you're inspired by or what you think is courageous. And I thought one of the best talks about that was, it's called, who was it? It was a young comedian in a wheelchair.
Is it Stella Young, Australian?
Yeah. Everybody should watch her talk in I'm Not Your Inspiration, because I think she really hits home on that. And for me, sometimes I say, a lot of times when people are coming up and they're gushing over me, I just get out of there as quickly as possible because I don't see a point in being rude or trying to correct them at that moment. Sometimes I recommend that they watch my TED Talk, Redefining Disability. But there's also a really good article by Charles Krauthammer. He did an opinion piece when they decided to do the Franklin Roosevelt Memorial, and they put him in a wheelchair. And I'll have to send you the title of that opinion piece. It was something like, he had a very good point. He said this adoration of people with disabilities and celebrating their courage is a way of distancing ourselves from them. It's the same thing as calling a black person a credit to their race. And I'll have to send you a copy of that.
Are you comfortable with being labeled disabled? And if you could use another word, what word would that be?
I think one of the reasons that Trump is president now is because we're seeing a backlash to this political correct bullying, where people are like, you have to use the correct words, you have to do this, you have to do that, how dare you, blah, blah, blah. For me, labels aren't that big a deal. Sometimes I correct people, and sometimes I don't. And I've defined myself, so it doesn't matter how other people define me. What matters is the people who are close to me and how they define me, not what somebody who I have never known and am never going to know thinks of me or what label they're using for me. They can call me Campbell's soup if they want. I mean, for me to be offended by that, I would spend my entire life being angry and offended, and I have more important things to do. So I'm working through my TED Talk, I'm working to educate the public. And through living my life, I'm working to educate the public. But whatever labels they choose to use, I mean, disabled's fine with me. I mean, I don't know what else I don't know what other word would work. Like, I hate special needs.
Yeah, well, I was recently in the United Arab Emirates, and they use people of determination.
That to me seems like that whole courageous thing. There are a ton of people out there. I mean, what makes a person with a disability a determined person? Some of them aren't people of determination at all. You know what I mean? It's just describing, for me, it's like acne. It's describing a physical characteristic that I have. You know, and if I'm going to meet somebody for the first time and in my wheelchair, I'm like, yeah, I'll be the 6'1" girl in the wheelchair and blonde, blah, 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 because it's a defining physical feature. It's like having blue eyes.
So the next set of questions are things to think about for the future. What do you see as the biggest challenges facing individuals with disabilities as a whole today, and how can we overcome these challenges as a group?
I think unemployment and standard of living and healthcare. And I think the one thing that would help people with disabilities more than anything get out into the working world is universal healthcare. I can't tell you how many people with disabilities I've spoken to, and they're like, well, I would work, but if I lose my job, I won't have healthcare. And so more than the Americans with Disabilities Act, I think Obamacare, in all of its, I mean, Obamacare is what allowed me to go out and start my own business because I had a pre-existing condition. And I couldn't do that under our old healthcare system. So I think having healthcare, universal healthcare, will be the biggest boon to people with disabilities. I also think that changing our own attitudes and changing other people's attitudes. But I think what needs to happen for people with disabilities is we need to have the same opportunities that the rest of the population has for education, for healthcare, for home ownership. You know, we're covered by the Constitution. We have the right to pursue life and happiness. And I think lack of healthcare keeps people with disabilities from the pursuit of happiness and what they really want in this life, because they're constantly worried about health bills and how they're going to pay for it. I went to the emergency room for the first time since my car crash with a kidney stone, and all I could think is, oh my God, this is so expensive. I was going through a CT scan. I was like, this is so expensive. And sure enough, I got the bill and it was like $6,000, $4,000 of which I had to pay. If I didn't have a good job, I would be SOL. So I think we need to continue to work on attitudes, and I think it needs to be a kinder, gentler conversation with the able-bodied population. And I think that we also need to start pursuing what we really want in this life, regardless of what other people think we can or can't do. And we need to contribute. We need to contribute to the very best of our abilities, whatever those abilities are. We are part of this community and part of this society, and disability insurance was never meant to be a lifetime thing. It was meant to hold you over if you had a disability when you became, so that you could get well and go back to work or be retrained. And so I recognize
I'm unclear about what's impeding people with disabilities from gaining employment, education, home ownership, because it's not like they're explicitly being excluded.
Right. They're not explicitly being excluded, and it's not institutionalized like it is for people of color. But I think it's this attitudinal barrier. We have such low expectations of people with disabilities that they have such low expectations of themselves. There was a great Wall Street Journal series about generational disability, about these families that have been on disability insurance generation after generation, and it's how they survive. And disability insurance was never meant to be used that way. And it's not that they have disabilities like ADHD and I don't know, it was a really great series, but it talks about this generational disability thing. And so these parents, rather than expecting their kids to do better than them, are just trying to get them on disability insurance, which isn't really that much money. And I think that there's this idea that if you have a disability, you can't contribute among the able-bodied population. And I think that has seeped into the attitude of a lot of people with disabilities. Well, I'm disabled, so I can't work.
Mm-hmm.
Or, so there's this I can't attitude rather than, I wonder what the possibilities are. I wonder how I could make this work. What is it I want to do with my life? How do I get there? I mean, people with disabilities are oftentimes really great problem solvers. I mean, think about yourself. I think about myself. When I first became disabled, I had to learn how to put my socks on without being able to bend over, or, how I was going to get from one place to another, how I was going to reach that thing on the top shelf. And I'm a really good problem solver, but we need to encourage that. What is your dream and how are you going to get there? Mm-hmm. And then we need to ignore these able-bodied attitudes that are like, oh, no, you can't do that.
Okay, so and then just broadening the scope to that question, what are some of the biggest challenges facing individuals with disabilities internationally? And what can be done to address them?
Well, I think internationally the attitudes are even worse. I also think in Europe the barriers are worse. In developing countries the physical barriers are worse. I think one of the things that we need to do is have more people with disabilities working in humanitarian aid and in development, because right now we are not addressing, when we're putting money into a country like Sudan or Iraq, we're not addressing in any significant way the needs of people with disabilities.
Mm-hmm. And I think many people with disabilities, at least in wheelchairs that I know, would like to do that. But the physical barriers are there, the medical barriers are there, the attitudinal barriers are there. And so breaking through all those barriers is quite the feat.
I agree with that, but I do know that, Bruce Curtis, who's a quadriplegic, came to Iraq to do work. I know that Denise Rosa of the Roche Society has started a really great program in Russia. And those programs, and also, so I think it's going to take somebody in a wheelchair who uses a wheelchair full time to have that passion and to want to do it. And that's when you're going to have a breakthrough on the wheelchair end, when they're like, okay, Medicaid, I'm not going to accept this. I want to go overseas, and you're going to figure out a way to make it happen. And that's going to mean talking to your congresspeople and really figuring out what those barriers are and how to take them down. As far as the attitudinal barriers overseas, you'll be breaking those left and right if you just go overseas.
Mm-hmm. So you've emphasized healthcare throughout this podcast, and you've talked about its importance in your life and in the lives of people with disabilities at large. What kind of health insurance plan would you like to see implemented in this country? What can America do to improve its current healthcare system?
Well, first of all, I think that people need to understand their healthcare, and I also think they need to understand their health. One of the things that I think is a myth is, so as a person with a disability, I'm super healthy. I rarely see the doctor. And one of the reasons that is because I know my body. And I can call my doctor if I have, let's say, a yeast infection. I can call him and I can say, hey, doctor, I have a yeast infection. Can you prescribe something? So then I don't have to go in. So I know how to manage my disability and manage my health. Also, for example, I broke my toe, my little toe. Mm-hmm. And I was living with a couple at the time, and Christine said to me, she goes, you need to go to the doctor. I'm like, I don't need to go to the doctor. He's just going to tape my little toe to my second toe and call it good. And so a lot of times I think people with disabilities, people with physical disabilities are much more aware of their bodies and much better at using the healthcare system, because first of all, we've already spent so much time in hospitals. We don't want to spend more time, so we're trying to limit our time. And second of all, we know when we need to go to the doctor and when we don't need to go to the doctor. I don't run to the doctor when I have a cold or the flu, it has to be pretty bad. And what really struck me at the emergency room the other night, August 9th, was all the people in the emergency room who didn't have emergencies. So I think we need to teach people how to be advocates for themselves. I think we need more preventative care. I get an annual checkup every single year. And I think that healthcare needs to be affordable for everyone, and everybody needs to have healthcare. And I think that by focusing more on preventative care and on educating people about healthcare and how to take care of themselves, that we can cut the costs of healthcare. But I also think that healthcare is a universal human right, because I know as a person with a disability that I have not been able to pursue what I wanted to in this life because of healthcare. And I don't think that's fair. I think that lessens the opportunities that people with disabilities have. And that is the one thing that we are entitled to, is the same opportunities as everyone else.
And what were those things that you were not able to pursue that the current healthcare system has stopped you from?
Well, I used to public speak. When I would fit it in, I was a public speaker, and I probably could have made a living public speaking if I could have had healthcare, but I had a pre-existing condition, and so I couldn't start my own business and become a public speaker back in my 20s because I couldn't get healthcare.
How did that stop you specifically? Like, what did you need it in order to start your business?
Well, in order to start my own business, I would have had to be insurable. And so I would have had to go out and buy my own policy. And I was uninsurable because I had a pre-existing condition. So there was not one single insurer who would sell me a policy unless I had millions of dollars. And so if I wanted to be in business for myself, I would have to forgo health insurance because I would make too much money to be on Medicaid, and I had a pre-existing condition which no one was going to insure. So there was no way for me to start my own business. I could only be insured under a pool of people working for someone else.
Mm-hmm. So if you were to, you've already done that, but for other individuals with disabilities today that would like to walk the same path, wheel the same path, they would, that barrier no longer exists.
It no longer exists, but it still exists, because then what if your business goes under and you can't get insurance and you can't get back on Medicaid or Medicare? And so it's the fact that there's no safety net there. And Obamacare is not cheap. I was paying, when I had my own business, I was paying $500 a month for health insurance. That is not cheap, particularly for someone who is trying to start their own business. When you're in the beginning of starting your own business, a $500 a month is a huge outlay. So although I'm always grateful for Obamacare, it's not enough. It's not enough to push people off of, or allow people to take the leap off of Medicare and Medicaid.
Mm-hmm. So shifting gears again, we've talked exhaustively about attitude and need to change attitudes. And I think the media definitely plays a big role in this area. What are the challenges disabled people face when trying to be more visible and present in the media? What progress has been made in including them in these on these platforms?
Well, I think the progress that's been made in including people with disabilities in the media. Charles Krauthammer was a journalist. He was a quadriplegic. I'm trying to remember his name, the guy who does The Takeaway. He's a journalist. And you know what? He has an interesting book. He wrote a book called Moving Violations. And this is a journalist in a wheelchair who went, I think it was Afghanistan, Iraq, and he's been all over the world in a wheelchair. And he had to get on a donkey to go for his interview. I think that not having able-bodied people play people with disabilities in movies, I think there are a lot of talented actors with disabilities out there. I don't think we need able-bodied people to portray us. I think that would be a huge step. I think there are more positive portrayals of people with disabilities out in the media and also on shows. But I still think the media has a tendency to do the courageous, inspirational story rather than the, hey, this is normal. This is just a person who has a different mode of transportation or who has a different way of viewing the world. And I think that the biggest barrier is still for people with mental disabilities, which oftentimes physical disabilities are accompanied by mental disabilities, which I think a lot of people don't realize.
Mm-hmm. What are some ways we can make people with disabilities feel more seen, and how are we made to feel invisible, if you've ever had that experience?
So I have, like, people asking the person next to you. I think it's I've had people, like, I've been out in my wheelchair and they turn to my friend and say, would the lady like that gift wrapped, or does she want, and I think speaking up and saying, hey, my legs don't work, but my mouth and mine work. And I think education is hugely important. But once again, I think that if you want to be seen, you have to get out and live your life and be seen. Do the things you want to do. I just saw a picture of a guy in a wheelchair being crowd surfed at a concert so he could get a better view. If that's a guy who's out there living his life, he's going to a concert that he wants to go to, and people are crowd surfing him to get a better view. But I also think that you can't, if you're out in the world and you're angry at everything and nothing's accessible and you're going to be attacking people all the time, then you're just helping us achieve the status quo. I think you need to be out there and you need to be flexible and you need to be willing to problem solve and deal with situations and educate people.
And along those lines, how can we empower more people with disabilities to want to be in film, theater, and the rest of the performing arts arena? And because these platforms are so crucial, especially today, in changing perceptions and progressing, attitudinal changes.
I don't think you need to empower people with disabilities to do that. I think that there are lots of people with disabilities who would do that. I think it's Hollywood and the perfection that Hollywood requires that sort of keeps people with disabilities out of that area. I mean, look at what those women are doing to their faces with plastic surgery. Talk about a disability. So I think that as more and more people become disabled, and I also think that if a major actor became disabled, it might really change, but that hasn't really happened yet. So, like when Gloria Estefan broke her back, she was already a great singer. Not that I'm wishing paraplegia on anyone, don't get me wrong, but if she'd become paralyzed and gone on singing, I think it would have been huge for people with disabilities. I mean, I'm glad she's not. I'm glad she's okay. I mean, I think Christopher Reeve, but he didn't really continue acting, see?
Were there any individuals with disability role models for you when you became injured? And if yes, who were they? If not, what improvements can be made so that there are more role models out there? And perhaps that's repetitive, the above questions, so you don't feel like you have to repeat anything.
When I was in ICU, my physical therapist kept talking to me about her husband. And she said something, and she said something that made them sound like a really normal family. But I knew he was in a wheelchair, and I can't remember the exact conversation. I wrote it down somewhere. But just the way she talked about him was so normal. And then I said something like, well, how does that happen? She goes, well, he just uses a wheelchair. I mean, it wasn't, he had polio when he was young. And he came up, she brought him up to visit me to talk. They were trying to recruit me to play wheelchair basketball in ICU. And a lot of people would think that that's really insensitive. But what they knew is that I wasn't going to ever play able-bodied basketball again. And the sooner I came to terms with my disability, the better off I would be. And so I would say that Lauren Cushing, he was a big influence in my life. He was my occupational therapist. His wife, Sandy Cushing, who's able-bodied, was my physical therapist in ICU. And then Lauren taught me how to hop curbs and get around in a world that wasn't accessible. And he ran the gym at the hospital, and I used to do wheelchair aerobics with him, and he's the one who got me out to play wheelchair basketball. So Lauren Cushing, and then later Coach Brad Hedrick at University of Illinois. I was in the sports program at University of Illinois, and I think the thing that I learned at University of Illinois is everybody at that rehabilitation center had expectations of me. They expected me to go to class, to be on time, to get my degree, and my parents. I mean, my mother was huge. I remember a conversation with my mother. I was injured on May 14th, 1988. I was supposed to go to France the next year on an exchange. And I said to my mom, it finally dawned on me about 3 weeks into ICU that I wasn't going to France anymore. And I said, I'm not going to France anymore, am I? And she's like, no, you're not. So what are you going to do? And that really took me back. And I said, I don't know, recover. And she was like, well, I think you should go back to school and try and complete your degree. And so here, this really horrible thing had happened to me. And my mother still expected me to get my degree, to get a job, and go on with my life. And I think that was a big push. And all my family was like that. None of my family gave me 1 inch of pity or babying simply because I was in a wheelchair or because this awful thing had happened to me. They all still had expectations of me. And I think that's a lot of time what's missing, is that our child becomes disabled and they're like, oh, come home, stay home for a year, rather than getting right back out into life. Now, that doesn't mean that my family didn't have a ton of empathy for me. They did, and they were very helpful. And my grandfather and grandmother lived on a farm, and he put, I don't know if it was for me or for Grandma, but he put this hand control on the four-wheeler so I could get around the farm on this four-wheeler that my grandma and I used. But I think that's, when I talk about expectations and attitude, I think it starts at home, and I think it starts with your attitude towards the person in your family who's disabled. If you're like, oh, they're there, everything's okay, do whatever you want, walk all over us, sit at home, mope, well, then that's what they're going to do. Whereas if you're like, you know what, you still have a life to live, get out there and do it to the best of your ability. And for some people, that may still mean a lot of time at home, but it doesn't mean not having a life and not being able to contribute in some way to your community around you.
Okay, so last question on media and performing arts. What should be changed about how beauty and sexuality is portrayed in the media in regards to people with disabilities?
Well, I think that Vogue or one of those fashion magazines should actually feature a woman with a disability on one. You know, we've had the bigger boned woman. Now let's have a woman with a disability. I just think that, you know, I think this focus of America on perfection is unachievable and ridiculous. And one of the things I really love about English shows is that the people on there they're not all beautiful. Whereas in American shows, just recently we're starting to see different body types and people who are not considered like drop dead gorgeous. And I think that's important. And we just need to take that a step further and also start seeing people with disabilities.
What specifically about perceptions of disability in the media regarding beauty and sexuality would you like changed?
I think beauty comes in all different forms, sizes. One of the biggest things I noticed is I was considered, not that I knew it, but people told me all the time when I was able-bodied that I was beautiful. And then when I got my wheelchair, people didn't say it anymore. And I'm not sure why, because my face hadn't been run over, just my legs. And I think as far as sexuality is concerned, I think there's this idea that people with disabilities aren't sexually active. And I can tell you from traveling with the USA men's wheelchair basketball team that they are. Some of those guys were horn dogs. So I think there's, once again, just that misperception that people with disabilities aren't or can't have sex. So it's also placing a limitation on their abilities. And I think there's a misconception about, if you watch that movie Murder Ball, the quadriplegics talk all the time about meeting women who wonder if they can have sex. So I think it's, once again, it's an attitude change, and that I don't think what makes people beautiful is what's on the outside, because I know that there are a lot of really beautiful people who are very ugly, and it's because of the way they act and who they are inside. And so I think attraction is about getting to know someone. Mm-hmm. And for me, having dated men in wheelchairs and able-bodied men, it's about who they are as a person, not about whether or not they get around using tennis shoes or get around using wheels.
So you're actually one of the few people that I've met who've dated as an able-bodied person and as a disabled-bodied person. What's been the difference?
I didn't date a lot before. So I didn't date a lot before I was 20 because I was super tall, but I did date some. I think in general.
What does super tall have to do with not dating a lot?
Because men don't want to date women who are taller than they are.
I see.
Or different. Like, I came from a farm background. I don't know. I had like one date in high school, and I had one boyfriend for like 6 months when I was 19. And then I became disabled. It's easier for men with physical disabilities to date than it is for women. And I think that's because women are more accepting of physical imperfection than men are. And that's just something I've observed.
Last two questions on business, since you started your own consulting business. And so what advice do you have for people, especially people with disabilities here, who are trying to start their own business? What resources would you have liked to see made available when you were starting your own consulting business?
So when I was starting my own consulting business, I was actually on unemployment, and they have classes for small emerging businesses. So I would recommend that you start small. I would recommend trying to start a business that doesn't require a lot of monetary outlay, like a store or anything like that. So I would start small. I think there are free classes about starting your own business. I would have a business plan in place. I would figure out how and I'm not an expert on any of this, and I got advice. And some of it you can get for free, and some of it you may have to pay for. Really sort of figuring out the steps before you take that leap. So having your ducks in a row. So how's it going to work? How am I going to advertise? Where are my clients going to come from? Taking advantage of any resources that are available for starting your own business, and also registering as an emerging business and a minority-owned business. People want to do, particularly government contracts, want to do business with emerging and minority-owned businesses. Or if you're a woman, also registering as a woman-owned business, a female-owned business. I can't speak too much to that. So with starting my own speaking business and consulting business, I got my LinkedIn profile up to date. I did a website. I made sure I had all the things I needed.
What challenges do wheelchair leaders face in the realm of starting a new organization or company that are different from the general population? And so just elaborating further on the above question, basically.
Health insurance. I think health insurance is a huge issue. And then I also think that the perception that the able-bodied population has about people with disabilities. I'm super excited. They're opening like the first Starbucks that's manned by all hearing impaired people. So I'm psyched about that. But that's getting off topic. I think that in my opinion, I think that people with disabilities face the same challenges, but maybe a little bit more it's difficult to take that leap, because I felt like it was difficult to take the leap and become a business owner and not be able to rely on a permanent paycheck and health insurance, I felt that was a difficult leap for me, just because I knew that I had to have health insurance, and I knew that I needed to make money, and how was I going to do that, and what would happen if I failed, and and I think that's a huge issue, particularly if you're someone with a disability and you're changing careers and you want to start your own company and you're like, okay, what if it fails and then I don't have health insurance? I just think the uncertainty can be more difficult to deal with. It was for me, at least, in my opinion.
Mm-hmm. Are there any last words that you would like to share, or life motto to end the session?
I just want to be part of a community. I just feel like we can all work to make our community better, and we can all work towards better understanding where people are coming from. And so one of the reasons I try and have kinder, gentler conversations is because I want able-bodied people to be on the side of people with disabilities. I don't want to offend them or alienate them. And I think a lot of what's going on in our world today is about alienating other people. And I really think that as human beings, we have so much more in common than we do differences. And so it's time for us to start focusing on our commonalities rather than our differences. And through that, I think we can come together and we can make our communities better places to live for everyone.
Thank you so much, Tiana Tozer, for giving us all this time and being so generous and thoughtful and answering the questions. And it was nice having this in-depth conversation with you.